A lot of us feel trapped in the endless social media cycle, but if you are a podcaster consistently putting out strategic content, you have a way to shortcut this. You have a social media easy button. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. We've had endless discussions around which is better, social media or podcasting. And the fact of the matter is they're different things. You are comparing apples and oranges. When it comes to social media, so many of us are spending a ton of time creating short form content with an even shorter lifespan. It feels like we are constantly held, chained, stuck in our phones, chasing the next trend, trying to figure out the next thing to post, trying to think of the right quippy way to position our messaging. And I think the most dangerous thing that really happens here is we start thinking about these from a social media only place. And what I mean by that is we're working for these platforms. We are working for these networks because it is us who is feeding this machine that is keeping their user base engaged. We are freely and willingly providing that free, quote unquote, content that sits around the ever present advertising content. The thing we're paying them to put in front of people. With that said, the answer is not always to run away. The answer is not always to disengage. I have spent years in the social media space professionally. I was a social media strategist for years. I taught social media marketing for years. I have been using social media as a way to further my business goals since way back when I interned after college, because my job even then was to build relationships with people via the internet. At the time it was MySpace. That tells you how long ago this was. To get them to do what I wanted them to do, which at the time was to submit music for a web radio station. Again, it was the dark ages of the internet. But my whole job was to connect, get the attention of, build relationships, and convert these folks into doing something I needed them to do. That was my first time in social media. Fast forward, I became a blogger. I was building content and creating community via Facebook groups and things like that. Fast forward a little further, I launched my first business. I'm a virtual assistant. I am providing social media services. Just that piece was 14 years ago. Fast forward more, and I am speaking and teaching on stages, in memberships, across communities, in companies of all sizes. I tell you this to tell you I spent a lot of time in social media. Fast forward a little further, and you'll find me kind of disconnect. Once we hit 2020, I shifted the business. We focused solely on podcasting as a service here at Uncommonly More. And I didn't spend a lot of time publishing anything on social media. Even now, even if you fast forward all the way to current day, you'll see me frequently on a couple of platforms. You'll see me on Threads. You'll see me on LinkedIn. You'll see me on Instagram from time to time. But I'm not working social media first anymore because I don't need to. It is absolutely an important and valuable part of my business. I also enjoy the way I engage with social media now, which is something that was not always true. But it's because I made a really important shift in these last 5 years in my relationship with social media. And that was I put it second. And frankly, it's lower than that. But when we're talking about the hierarchy of content creation, it sits firmly behind my podcast. In fact, the only reason social media content goes out from me is because it has been built into my podcast production process. My social media is driven completely podcast first. And that's what I want us to talk about today, because this burnout we are putting ourselves through, this chase, this hamster wheel we are riding on, endlessly putting out 30 and 60-second clips that have a lifespan of about 48 hours is not sustainable. And that's not what we're doing here. We are too far into this to be chasing unsustainable processes, unsustainable routes to clients. We want to build something that is sustainable. We want us to build something that will be with us when we've got a ton going on and we're super excited and we've got lots to share, and to build something that will be with us when the payoff of all that visibility has arrived and we are neck deep in delivery with clients. And the way you do that is by building your short form content, building your shorter shelf life content on the back of your long form, long shelf life content. And so that means using your podcast as the first step. But you have to take some steps to do that. You have to be thinking about that from the beginning. And that's what we're going to dig into today. Before we dig into this, I want to remind you, if you haven't yet, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast newsroom, because we have just released a new episode this week. Over there, we are talking about when you run out of content ideas. Honest to goodness, this episode and that episode paired together so freaking well. I should pretend it was on purpose, and it wasn't. It was just that was the next question in the queue to answer over on the podcast newsroom, and so it worked out really well. If you've not yet subscribed, head over to thepodcastnewsroom.com and make sure you get your access to the private feed. That is a spot where I answer listener questions twice a month. Even better, you can submit your own question over at uncommonlymore.com/AMA. So podcastnewsroom.com to make sure you get your podcast newsroom access, and then submit your question over at uncommonlymore.com/AMA. More questions coming soon. All right, let's shift back into what we're talking about today. Let's shift back into some of this podcast stuff. We talk a lot about social media. We talk a lot about coming up with the right ideas and the right angles and hitting the trends. But in reality, if you're producing a weekly podcast, you already have all of your social media content. You just need to put it in that format. Like I said, this is something that I have actually built into my production process. This is something I have as a part of my routine so that my social media is effortless. Honestly, this is the backbone and the only reason any amount of social media content goes out. And the same is possible for you. You just have to take that step. You just need to be leveraging your podcast to do this. Here's what I want to break down. What can be created when you're consistently creating new podcast content? When I create one podcast episode, so when we are on the other side, I'm recording this, it'll get edited, we'll have a transcript created, the show notes will be written, the graphics will be created. When our production team does this for our clients, and this is what gets created for my show too, we hand over 2 audiograms, quote graphics, episode graphics, the transcript, and the show notes. The transcript means that we can then take anything we said and recreate it in email format, in long form format, in something like a LinkedIn newsletter. We can be turning that into shorter form content like LinkedIn posts, like threads, like posts over on Blue Sky, like Instagram captions, we can be repurposing that content and that value into Instagram carousels. We can be taking those audio clips and turning them into, like I said, short form content for Reels or TikTok or LinkedIn video. Any of those things can be created when we have those marketing assets. We even have clients who take our show notes and rework just the show notes without the whole transcript into their email. You have so much already created when you're using your podcast as the content engine. Like I said, I have this built in. So I get all my stuff. It's all together. This episode's scheduled. I've got a link. It's ready to go. This is exactly what we would hand off to any of our production clients. But when I get that, here's what I do. I take my transcript and I go and I write my email. I have a chat bot that I built custom in ChatGPT that is completely custom, built out with my voice, built out with my transcripts, that has examples of templates of my email format in it. I go and I drop my transcript in there and I have it write me an email. I then take that email and I edit it because even though I am using a custom GPT that I have built, it's going to need a human pass. So I go in and I edit the email. You generally increase the personalization and decrease the fluff. I'm going to be honest, no matter how hard I train that thing, there's still some extraneous stuff that's just not my vibe. I tend to be a little more like point, point, point when it comes to my writing. And so I do that. I take that process. And then I guess what? I schedule my email in Kit, not ConvertKit. I'm dating myself here. In Kit. From there, I go back to that same GPT, that same custom GPT that I built. And by the way, you could do this with ChatGPT. You could do this with the transcript on your own. I use a custom GPT because it is the fastest way to get these things into my voice so I can minimize the edits I have to do on the back end. I front loaded some work in building this so that I could take advantage of that and streamline my back end. So I'm taking those same assets and I'm having it create my LinkedIn posts. And I go and I schedule my LinkedIn posts. I have it create my Instagram captions. And I go and I pair those Instagram captions with the Instagram or with the graphics and the short form audiograms that have already been created. So I'm not going in and creating a bunch of additional graphics. When I rework content, when I'm looking to repurpose something into another way, I want additional content. I will then sometimes go in and repurpose that value into like a series of carousel graphics or something like that. But just right built into my production, no. I'm just having it create captions to go with the graphics already created by my production team. So that gets me a quote graphic, a short form video. And generally what I do is I only do 2 posts. I do the short form audiogram and I do a carousel of the episode graphic and the quote graphic. That way I kind of get double exposure with just one post, because what Instagram does is it will feed graphic 1 and then it will feed graphic 2 to the same group. It just sort of shifts the carousel over. So I get double duty without having to double post. Just a thing I do. And then I have it create threads because that is the sort of short form written content or platform rather that I have really liked. I've really loved being on Threads. I've gotten a ton more active on Threads. And guess what? Because I have a baseline of content going out, I'm much more likely to go in there and share randomly, impulsively. I post fresh stuff like live, just me talking stuff almost every day. Not generally the weekends, but every day during the week, I'm in there just engaging and posting because I have the capacity to do that, because I bought that capacity by using this tool. What I do with that Threads piece is, and even the Instagram piece and even the LinkedIn piece, is I'm not just creating content that promotes the episode, but I'm having it rework it into what I'm going to call thought leadership content. And yes, I'm not the first person to call this that, but it's the category it sits in my head, where it's really just value based. It's engagement focused. It's not about driving you off the platform. It's about building the sort of record of my perspective and thoughts. So when when you go find somebody new and you're scrolling, trying to figure out who they are and what they're talking about and what they do, That's part of what I want this thought leadership content to do. So when you're scrolling, you see the stuff that's just value, that's just my perspective, that's just my take, that's just who I am, what I do, and how I deliver. So I'm having it mix in that kind of content. I'm also, because guess what? I used my podcast to sell. So I'm also having it generate sales-focused messaging using the value in that transcript. And so it's not a generic, hey, come join me. Now we have those too because those work too sometimes. So many touches, right? But I also have tied to the lesson in the podcast. A great example of this is recently we did a episode for the podcast newsroom where we were talking about episode length. And so you will see threads from me where I'm talking about episode length and I am pointing to signing up for the podcast newsroom because that's where that episode is. But you'll also see threads from me at some point that are tying that value into, and that's how, we're deciding that in a podcast strategy intensive. Now that's very sloppy writing because I'm winging this off the top of my head, but you know what I'm saying. I can tie that value. Here's the linchpin though. Here's the critical step that has to exist for this to be possible. For my podcast to be an engine that feeds all of my content, my email, my various social media platforms. I have to be sitting down and doing the strategy time and the strategy work so that I'm building something worth repurposing. And this is the step that gets skipped. If you are struggling to repurpose your podcast into high value social content, into calls to sales driven short form social content, it's because you've not done that sales and strategy work for the podcast. Whether you're doing it, whether you're having a human on your team do it, or whether you're having a robot do it via AI, it can only pull content that's already there. It cannot create value that didn't exist in that first round. And that's why you have to be building your podcast strategically so that you can pull this lever. This is the disconnect for most people trying to repurpose, is they didn't build the first thing strategically. And that's one of the reasons we're launching, and this is a sneaky thing I'm going to share with you here. We're launching a brand new way to launch podcasts. I'm calling it the Profitable Podcast Launch Accelerator. It's opening for beta right now, as in today. It just opened. It will be available for our beta price through the end of the month and or when we book 5. Calls will start in April. I'm going to talk a ton more about this over the following weeks. But what I'm doing is I'm building a 60-day container where we are going to build you a 12-episode season of a podcast that is an asset. This can either be used to launch your show and you go on the other side of the season and you keep it going either seasonally or evergreen. That's a decision we can make in the container together. This could be used to relaunch a show that maybe you let go of or stepped away from because it wasn't doing what you wanted it to do. This is a way to step back into that without that long-term commitment. Because we're going to completely build you a podcast, a first season of a podcast together. We're going to sit down and make all the decisions around your name and your audience and your cover art and your launch date and your timing. We're also going to have conversations around what that 12 weeks of content is going to be, what it is tied to, why it exists. We're going to build out a launch plan so that you can effectively promote this season, so that you can effectively promote this new podcast, so that you do drive listeners to it. And it can work as a sales asset for you. And for some folks who add the full production upgrade, we're even going to produce it, which means in 60 days, you could go from no podcast to a full season of a podcast ready to release and share and drive sales for you. Again, we are beta testing this. We are starting to sell beta testing spots in March. The first calls will start in April. We'll work together in April and May, which means this summer we could be launching dozens of new podcasts if you raise your hand and sign up. The kind of work we're talking about today, building the kind of podcast that allows you to step out of the endless cycle of social media burnout, is built this way. It's built sales first. It's built with a clear understanding of who you're talking to and what you want them to do next, and really what they need to do next to solve the problem they're searching for a solution on. It's as simple as that. If you want to jump in and take advantage of one of these beta spots for the Profitable Podcast Launch Accelerator, go to uncommonlymore.com/accelerator and you can get all of the information. You can either grab your spot right there, book it, buy it, or if you go all the way to the bottom of the page, you'll see an option to book a call with me. If you need a gut check, if you need to get clear on if it's the right time for you, if you want to do this and you want to take advantage of the beta pricing, but you need to do it in May, June, whatever it is, reach out. I'm happy to chat with you. But I want you to shift the way you're thinking about your podcast. I want you to think about podcasting as a foundation of all of your marketing. I want you to think of it as the central hub that feeds the marketing and messaging for the whole rest of your business. Because it can be that if you slow down, you get out of the endless cycle of just trying to get content out, and you think about what you're putting out and why you're putting it out. If those two things aren't understood, you will not be able to meaningfully repurpose and get additional value and life out of what you're creating. And doing that, getting that extra life, it is the only way to get out of that hamster wheel. It is that only way to buy yourself some capacity. And are we not all trying to buy ourselves a little extra capacity? All right? Head on over to uncommonlymore.com, check out the accelerator, and I cannot wait to see you and help you launch your new podcast inside the Profitable Podcast Launch Accelerator, which, by the way, and I don't know that I mentioned this, is one-on-one. It's just going to be you and me. This is not a group program. This is not a course. This is you and me. It's done with you. We're doing it together. All right? Again, uncommonlymore.com/accelerator. I can't wait. I'm super excited. I'll see you right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.